All right, hello everybody. Welcome to Unbiased America Live. We're back here. We have a special guest today. We'll get to that in a second. But first, I will introduce our panel, our semi-regular panel. We have Kevin Ryan at the bottom of your screen there with the collared shirt on that looks like it's never been washed.
I would like to say I have been regular for at least a couple weeks.
He's the purveyor of Unbiased America, which is the father of this program. Also, we have, as usual, Grant Phillips, who's the purveyor of The Modern Libertarian and a contributor to We Are Capitalists, who have been coming out with some of those great videos on capitalism. And I think that we should actually extrapolate that into some constitutional provisos as well. And with us tonight, we have a special guest. It is author Adam Freedman of A Naked Constitution and A Less Perfect Union, The Case for States' Rights. Very good books. I always, when people ask me, because I write about the Constitution for Unbiased America, people always ask me they want an introductory book into understanding the Constitution, and Grant has asked me this too, and I always recommend The Naked Constitution because it's easy. When I say easy to read, I mean it has a good flow to it. There's a lot of information in there. It's all, you could look it all up. It has a great notes section in the back. There's not so much legalese in it, and there's great stories that relate it to real life constitutional provisions and jurisprudence that you can relate to your own life. I first want to ask, not necessarily, well, I'll start with A Less Perfect Union. What was the reason for writing A Less Perfect Union? Do you see federalism itself, or federalism in the eyes of the framers, as a way to mitigate a lot of the problems we're seeing at the federal level and their usurpation of states' rights?
Yes. Hi, Will, and it's great to be on. Thanks for having me on the show. And that's exactly right. I think when I look out at the political landscape, and after I finished Naked Constitution, I was not optimistic about the idea at the federal level of really restoring constitutional government as it was originally understood at the federal level. But I think that we have a chance to get closer to that with states' rights, because there's something in states' rights for everyone. There are blue states that want to be a little bit more liberal than Washington sometimes. There are a lot of red states that would like to be, more conservative than Washington. And when George W. Bush was president, liberals were all about states' rights. And so the challenge is to make the argument, and this is what I tried to do in the book, make the argument in a way that would appeal to both left and right to understand that really the future is in your states and communities. That's where government should take place.
So essentially, that federalism it fosters diversity and tolerance throughout throughout the geographic distance of the United States. I mean, there's a lot of people in Texas are different than those in New York. People in New York are different than those in California. So they could tailor their government to their own predilections.
That's right, and it's never been clearer, I think, than now in this sort of age of Obama. And look at what the administration is doing to people like the Little Sisters of the Poor that are now forced to provide contraception when it's completely against their beliefs. And that if one state did that, that would be unfortunate. But now, when the federal government does it, it's a tragedy. It's they're taking away the rights nationwide of religious believers. The federal government has forced a definition of marriage down the throats of the entire country. And so, if liberals like to talk about diversity, if they really want diversity, they should let states be states.
Okay. My next question is about the premise of your book. It's states' rights. I mean, it is really the case for states' rights. A lot of people will tell you that states don't have rights, only people do. Is states' rights the correct terminology to use when defending federalism?
Yeah, I think so. And I always find it odd that people say that states don't have rights. States are legal entities that have powers and rights. They have duties, powers, rights. And in the international context, people left and right have no problem talking about states' rights. They always say that Ukraine has the right to self-determination, or Tibet has the right to be free. But when you bring that home to America and say, well, doesn't Alabama have the right to self-determination when it comes to things like health care or environmental law? Suddenly, the idea of states' rights doesn't sit so well with a lot of progressives. But absolutely, I think states have rights, and the founders did too.
Okay. Moving along, I like your you talk a lot in the book about how states' rights is the term has really been used to deride federalism. That it's this the racist term, that states' rights was used as a defense for the southern states to secede. That, oh, it's our right to enslave other people. Where in fact you really lucidly clear it up. I think this might be the most important part about the book, is where you talk about that the southern states were trying to use the federal apparatus to coerce the northern states into enforcing the Fugitive Slave Acts and so forth, which the North found morally repugnant. Can you explain a little bit of that for the viewers? I think libertarians get a little bit confused on this sometimes. A lot of them just parrot that, oh, states' rights for this in defense of the South, and they just couldn't be more incorrect.
That's right, Will, and you know. Almost half of my book is really a kind of revisionist history, and it was a very deliberate choice to call this book the case for states' rights rather than the case for federalism, because federalism as a word has really been diluted into just some kind of vague recognition that states kind of exist and they can participate in implementing federal laws. Well, that doesn't really get you anywhere. States' rights, the original doctrine of the United States being a union of states, a compact among states, really needs to be revived. And so I went back through the history and talked about this way that really in the antebellum era, the slave powers held all the cards at the federal level. There was no federal threat to slavery.
Mm-hmm. And in fact, Lincoln acknowledged that. Lincoln said, "There's nothing that I can do about slavery." So I'm sorry. Continue.
Yeah, no, that's right. That's right. Lincoln never proposed in when he was running for Senate or when he was running for president. He never proposed a federal abolition of slavery. He believed that slavery would eventually wither away of its own right. His case was allowing states and territories the freedom to not have slavery, and also the freedom to not participate in fugitive slave laws, and the freedom not to allow slave owners to transit across their property, across their territory with their slaves. And so when you look at what the South, when the southern states seceded to form the Confederacy, if you look at their resolutions, and I include this, as you know, Will, in the book, a lot of the southern states, when they left the Union, said they were doing it because the northern states were nullifying federal law. Mm-hmm. It was states that refused to participate in the Fugitive Slave Act, and their fear was that the North would become this magnet for slaves, and they would deplete the Southern economy by drawing the slaves away from them. So I think modern history has it exactly backwards. The idea that states' rights was the rallying cry of Jefferson Davis and the Confederacy is exactly wrong. When they formed the Confederacy and they wrote the Confederate Constitution, actually states had fewer rights than they did in the original U.S. Constitution.
And I think a lot of the problem is when we talked about Lincoln and how he felt that there was nothing he could do constitutionally to get rid of slavery. And the way Lincoln acted was that he said, I'm not going to war to end slavery, I'm going to war to preserve the Union. Without a Union, how can you ever eventually end slavery? So they win the Civil War, preserve the Union, pass the Civil War amendments.
Right.
I don't know. So I don't know how that gets confused, really. Is it the history textbooks? What's happening?
Yeah, well, I think that after the Civil War, there was a real effort to discredit the idea of states' rights, and tarring the Confederacy with states' rights was an effective way to do that, because obviously the Confederates were viewed as rebels and traitors. The party of Lincoln, the Republicans at that time, had a very strong nationalistic agenda, and so people like people who survived Lincoln, like Webster, and Seward, sorry, not Webster, but yeah, people like Seward had a very national agenda, and they wanted to increase the role of the federal government. That was part of the Republicans' agenda in that late 19th century, and so you saw a really concerted, almost a propaganda effort among Republicans of that day to emphasize the idea of America as a nation, which was a very controversial idea. People don't realize it so much now, but the idea of describing America as a nation rather than as a union was very controversial. And so there was a concerted effort throughout the late 19th century and then into the progressive era to emphasize the idea of the United States as a single nation with a unitary system of laws and states' rights as an anachronism and a relic of the Confederacy. And so the facts just got lost, I think, in that whole propaganda effort.
I'm going to ask one more question that's somewhat complicated, then I'm going to get to Kevin, because he has a good question. Kevin, I want you to ask that one we talked about before we went on air. But to your point there, as a nation, technically we're not a nation, and Madison kind of talked about this a little bit with his letters to Calhoun. I don't know if you've read any of those, Adam. They're in the early 30s when Calhoun was talking about a state veto. He described the United States Constitution as not creating a confederacy and not creating this consolidated government, but like an amalgam of both.
Yeah.
That you had the sovereign people as a collective and you had sovereign states as parties to the Constitution, and that it's literally a United States, a union, as he said, not a nation, nor a confederacy. So there goes the right to this perceived right to secede, in my view. Would you agree?
Yeah, no, I think that's basically right. I mean, there are the Constitution has there are national aspects to it. We have a standing army. We have a single tariff system when we face other countries. So, there are national aspects to it. But in general, the word nation, coming from Europe, implied a really consolidated nation-state like they had in France or the United Kingdom, and that's something that the founders and the generation, the next few generations after the founding never wanted. They never thought that the United States should ever be that kind of consolidated nation. So they resisted that term. The word nation doesn't appear anywhere in the Constitution. None of the Federalist Papers talk about creating a nation. And really, the idea of states' rights, and I know we'll probably get to nullification and interposition in a minute, but the idea was always to preserve the Union. It was never the states' rights was never about secession. It was about giving states the power to make the Union work. Mm-hmm. It wasn't about leaving. Secession is about rejecting the Union. Interposition and nullification are really about negotiating within the Union. Yeah.
Right. That's a really good point. Okay. Kevin, go ahead. And by the way, let me introduce Matt. That's Matt Palumbo. Matt Adam. Matt always comes late.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
He just got back from soccer practice, right? Was that? Yeah. Okay. Go ahead, Kevin.
Yeah. Well, just to branch out of what you said about nullification and interposition, there's been an issue lately with sanctuary cities in terms of refusing to cooperate with federal law regarding immigration rules, and that right there is an example of interposition that has basically been a successful strategy for these cities that have declared themselves sanctuary cities, and yet nullification is a process that has come under a lot of attack by people who are in support of the strong central government. What's the difference between the two?
Right. Well, that's a great question. It's a great question, but one with a very complicated answer, because it's not. There are no clear dictionary definitions, right, of interposition and nullification. It's generally thought that the concept of nullification arose from Jefferson's Kentucky resolutions of 1798, whereas interposition grew out of Madison's Virginia resolutions of 1798. Madison, as I think is sort of typical was the more precise writer, as between Jefferson was much more inspirational, Madison more lawyerly and precise. Interposition simply says that a state can do anything within its power so as to, in Madison's words, arrest the development or arrest the progress of a federal policy that the state finds contrary to its policy. So it doesn't suggest a veto of federal law, but it suggests that states have the right to withhold their support in implementing any federal law that they find counterproductive. And the question of nullification was a little bit more ambiguous, whether or not that meant that a state had a veto. Some people have charged that, although that wasn't really the way that either Jefferson or Madison dealt with their resolutions in 1798. They took their resolutions and they sent it out to all the other state legislatures. They were, at that time, as you know, they were protesting the Sedition Acts of President Adams, and they urged all the other legislatures of the Union to pass similar resolutions. And if they thought that they could single-handedly veto a federal law, they wouldn't need to do that. They were engaging in a kind of public diplomacy among the states. Remember, again, at that time, the Union was a real union. It was almost, the United States was almost like a gathering of sovereign nations. And so these were the legislatures of two of the sovereign states recommending that these other states oppose the Sedition Acts. Later on, the idea of nullification under Calhoun, when he opposed the Tariff Acts, became a little bit closer to the idea of a state veto. Calhoun suggested that they weren't going to allow, and there were, I think it's a complicated history, but I think there was at least some suggestion that South Carolina might actually interfere with customs collectors in the state of South Carolina trying to collect customs. But there would be other ways to achieve that goal short of a state union. For example, you could allow the federal government to collect customs. The state could give a rebate, or the state could actually there could be a state level lawsuit against the federal official who collects what South Carolina considers an unlawful customs tax. And in fact, the habeas corpus, the habeas corpus provision in the Constitution was partly there for federal officials who got sued by states, with the idea of protecting federal officials who got sued by states. So, look, I could go on a lot longer, but basically, the idea of a state veto, if it ever existed in the minds of Calhoun or Jefferson, isn't really, I think, a constitutional solution. We have other solutions. But the idea of interposition, as much as liberals hate to admit it, has been ratified again and again in the fugitive slave context and in what the Supreme Court now calls the anti-commandeering doctrine. It's the same doctrine that allowed 34 states to simply refuse, 36 states to refuse to set up Obamacare exchanges. You can't force a state to implement a federal law.
And to recap and to simplify a bit, Madison wrote about the anti-commandeering rule. That was his vision of interposition necessarily. Also, would you agree with the statement that as Thomas Jefferson, to a degree, and Madison saw, and their vision of interposition was for legislatures to make known to other states and to the people that they saw a federal statute as unconstitutional? Because I believe it was Madison that felt that legislatures didn't have the sovereign capabilities to declare a law unconstitutional, to nullify law. That the legislature itself wasn't a sovereign body to the Constitution. It was the state as a whole and the people as a whole. Would that be correct?
That's right. That's right. The parties to the contract, and it's an important point. The parties to the compact, it's not the state politicians who happen to hold power at a particular time. It's the people of the whole state in perpetuity who are the parties to that contract, and they have an equal right to interpret the Constitution as an equal right to any other state, and the Congress and the courts and the administration. They're all parts of the overall federal government. And so there were states who reacted to the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions by actually denying that states had the power to declare constitutional interpretation. I think that that's dead wrong, and I think that Madison was absolutely right, that we are parties, our states are parties to the contract, and each state has the right to declare what it believes to be constitutional or not. And that, just one concluding thought on that, a lot of liberal states have taken that position when it's convenient for them.
Right.
So when under Bush, states were concerned about using their National Guard for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, there were resolutions in blue states, deep blue states, saying that the governor should have the right to interpose and refuse to deploy National Guard troops when called upon by the federal government to fight overseas.
Good point.
And you had some very interesting commentary by very left-wing state officials saying this is our sovereign right to declare the constitutionality of any order that comes across our desk.
And just to clear up before we get back to Kevin too, on Calhoun was talking about a state veto in regards to a tariff that was imposed by by the federal government to harm the South economically. Calhoun makes a really great case for it. You explain it very well in the book, and I think that's what people, certainly modern libertarians today, confuse nullification with Calhoun's idea of the state veto, and I think that's where you get that idea today of nullification as a state just, well, we're just going to disregard that law or act contra to said law. Would you agree?
Yeah, no, that's right. Nullification, Calhoun didn't take this lightly either. Look, for all of his faults, he was a very educated statesman with 40 years of experience in government, and he had a very serious argument as to why that tariff was not authorized under the government's taxing power, which requires taxes to be levied for the general welfare.
Right.
And the tariff that he was opposing was a blatantly sectional piece of legislation designed to punish the South. And so I think that in the debate between Calhoun and Andrew Jackson trying to force the South to implement that tariff, Calhoun had it absolutely right, and
I agree.
Yeah, and the power that South Carolina was asserting to as a co-equal interpreter of the Constitution, I think was correct.
Okay, Kevin, go ahead.
Actually, come back to me after. Why don't we get Maddie and Nico Bellic on here to ask
Sure.
a question?
I know that because I recommended your other book to Grant, and he started reading it. He has some questions from the Naked Constitution, actually. So, Grant, go ahead, and then we'll get to Matt.
All right. Thanks, Kevin. You're very greasy tonight, and you haven't aged very well at all.
No problem, Nico.
So your book, The Naked Constitution, is great. Definitely the best education I've had in on the Constitution. Definitely a lot better than the one I got in public school.
Thanks.
So one of the first question I want to talk to you about is Sarbanes-Oxley. And in the book, you specifically cite a case that Sarbanes-Oxley formed this Politburo, just so our listeners know. It's called the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board. Friendly known as Peekaboo, and here's this small accounting firm, and one day 7 inspectors show up, knock on their door, and end up sitting there for 2 weeks, and they take a year to complete this report, give them 30 days to respond, and basically force them to adhere to these gold-plated standards that are used for the big 4 accounting firms, meaning giant corporations. So essentially the federal government is forcing a small business to adhere to standards that are imposed on, or are expected to be adhered to by these multi-billion-dollar companies, which in my opinion is unrealistic. But moving on, the owner, they lost 60% profit margin. The owner basically gets driven out of the market along with possibly other small businesses. Eventually they're cleared of all charges, The interesting point that you make is that we are beyond the days of being able to call your congressman to put pressure on the president to get this Politburo to back off, to leave you alone. And the reason is because these Politburos are basically protected from at-will dismissal. And I believe you said unless they break the law or if they're caught in bed with a goat. Yeah. So what was argued in court was that it was a violation of the Unitary Executive Clause. So what I want to understand more is Peekaboo the only one in violation of this clause, or are other regulatory Politburos like the EPA, the FDA, the USDA, and on and on and on, are they in that same situation, or is it just only when they abuse small businesses?
Now, there are a lot of federal bodies that violate the principle of the unitary executive. The Peekaboo case was based on fairly limited facts because there were two layers of sort of untouchable bureaucrats between the president and the citizen, and so the court's decision was limited to that. You had the Peekaboo board, which was insulated from at-will dismissal, but they themselves were appointed by the Securities and Exchange Committee. Securities and Exchange Commission, whose commissioners are also protected by at-will dismissal. So it's an unusual case, but not that unusual, because Stephen Breyer, in dissent in that case, added an appendix of all of the other federal bureaus, all these really obscure little federal boards that are also insulated by at least two layers of non-at-will dismissal. And so, interestingly enough, he thought that was an advertisement that, boy, the federal government is so great and all these boards are so great, how can you endanger them? To me it was terrifying, this long list of completely unresponsive federal bodies. So even under that limited definition of two layers of insulated bureaucrats, there are lots of examples of this. But frankly, I think all of the so-called independent administrative agencies, where you have commissioners like the Federal Communications Commission and other bodies that are essentially insulated from democratic pressure, I think they all violate separation of powers.
And following up on that, on the FCC, they recently imposed net neutrality, right? And that wasn't brought up for democratic vote. That wasn't that wasn't in Congress. That wasn't a ballot or anything like that. They just willed it. They just kind of wished it into power. And their commissioners sort of voted on it behind closed doors, and no one really even knew what was in the law before. I think it was 90 days after they actually voted on it that it was made public. And is that not a complete violation of the Constitution, just outright ignoring it?
Well, it depends who you ask, right? if you ask me, yeah. But the courts have made peace with this in a number of ways. There is, in theory, there's a doctrine that Congress cannot delegate legislative power to executive or administrative agencies. But unfortunately, that principle has really been watered down to nothing.
Isn't that a violation of the separation of powers?
Well, exactly. But the Federal Communications Commission has a very broad congressional mandate to divvy up the airwaves in a way that's fair and equitable. Yeah. And unfortunately, the courts have held that that's specific enough. That's enough specificity from Congress, and the FCC can kind of take the ball and run from there. And we see that also with the EPA, right? So this is happening a lot right now, where you have the clean air. The last time Congress really gave significant powers to the EPA was in the early 70s, right? With the EPA and with the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, and there have been amendments over time, but nothing that authorizes the kind of regulations that the EPA has been proposing under Obama. But the agencies go through a process where they publish their proposed rules in the Federal Register, and they leave them open for comment for 60 days, and people can write letters and make their views known. And that process has been blessed by the courts as sufficiently democratic for our system.
And just to elaborate on that, aren't there EPAs at the state level?
There are, and I talk a lot in A Less Perfect Union. I talk a lot about how this myth that the federal government is the only possible responsible steward of the environment is ridiculous. The states have always been in the lead when it comes to environmental protection. And actually, I wrote the book before this recent incident out west, where the Army Corps of Engineers was responsible for dumping, thousands, if not millions, of gallons of toxic waste into this river. I think you probably also those pictures of that river out west, where it was
Animas River.
Okay, yeah. So it was like like a gold color, with it, glowing with this toxic waste, and that was all. Thank you very much. The federal government was responsible for that.
Right. Grant, do you have any more questions? I'm sure
yeah. I got a couple more. So, also in your book, a case that I actually never had heard about, because I don't really know. I'm not very familiar with some of the constitutional law. You cited a case called Gibbons versus Ogden, and it was basically essentially Ogden had a New York State steamboat operator license. Gibbons had one from the federal government, and I guess Ogden didn't like competing with Gibbons, so he took him to court and said that Gibbons' license was invalid because it was federally issued and they don't have the constitutional power to regulate traffic. Right, is what his lawyer argued, and Chief Justice John Marshall agreed with him, but in his opinion, he basically went on this rant and ended up sort of leaving out this ambiguous legal precedent that you cited as sort of a time bomb, and you use that to walk into that it was used for FDR to basically run roughshod over the Constitution and just approve all these federal programs when he had the votes in the Supreme Court, and that was the legal precedent. And throughout the book, numerous times you cite sort of activist judges with their opinions on certain cases as being used for legal precedents. Do you see that still even happening today with like modern day court cases, like even on like Obamacare and all the big Supreme Court decisions, or has that sort of just been thrown away and now we just have outright activist judges? If that makes sense.
Yeah, you still have that, right? So, Chief Justice Marshall was an early example of an activist judge who had a very clear agenda that he wanted to advance through his opinions. But even today, you see activist judges who will go beyond, they will go beyond the activism that is needed to achieve a particular result, and they will use language that will help them achieve future results. So the whole legal history of the same-sex marriage controversy is a good example of that, because when, if you go back in time, the Romer v. Evans case, which struck down a Colorado law regarding gay rights, that was struck down by a slim majority, and with very broad, flowery language from Justice Kennedy. And Justice Scalia said in dissent that this is going to lead the way. Eventually, what you're doing is this is going to become gay marriage. And the majority poo-pooed him and said, "Oh, Scalia, you're nuts. You're using scare tactics." And then a few years later, we got to the case regarding DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act, and again, the federal definition of marriage enshrined in DOMA was struck down by the court with a lot of flowery language from Justice Kennedy, much broader than he needed to do, and Justice Scalia said, "What's with all this broad language? This is going to turn into a federal constitutional right to gay marriage." And everyone said, no, Justice Scalia, that's not what this is about. This is a very narrow case. That's all he's deciding. And sure enough, then you got the Obergefell decision, and Justice Kennedy, citing his own past decisions, resurrects this language and creates out of thin air a constitutional right to gay marriage. And so this happens all the time.
All right, here's my last question. I wanna tick off some libertarians here.
Yes.
So after the Supreme Court gay marriage decision, a lot of libertarians, including myself, when it first came out, jumped to the conclusion that because they had made this legal precedent that basically a state license, the federal government ruled a state license is enforceable in other states. Like if you have a gay marriage license in Rhode Island, it's good in Texas, right? So the first thing that I said was, okay, well, if I have a concealed carry permit from Pennsylvania, I should be able to carry in New York City, right? Because it's kind of the same thing. And Will actually pointed out to me that the Second Amendment says that Congress shall make no law to infringe upon the right to bear arms. So if you could for a minute talk about how the incorporation doctrine and how that the Supreme Court gay marriage ruling, regardless of our own opinions on it, doesn't necessarily affect the right to carry a firearm in any state you want, because I know a lot of states have passed like constitutional carry. So essentially people were arguing that if you get pulled over in whatever state you're in, you can pull out the Bill of Rights and say, look at the Second Amendment.
Okay, right.
It's a lot there for you.
Yeah, that's right. So, right, I think the damage that was done by Obergefell, I think, can be recognized regardless of what you think is a policy matter about gay marriage. A lot of headlines proclaimed that the Supreme Court has legalized gay marriage, and that's not correct. It's important to remember, Obergefell did not legalize gay marriage. It mandates gay marriage. It requires it.
It is a right.
Yeah,
right. It created a right.
It's a right, but it forces states to issue gay marriage licenses. Now, when you get to the Second Amendment, I think I think that the current state of the law is almost right. The Supreme Court has held, I think correctly, that the Second Amendment creates an individual right rather than just a collective right of members of a militia. And what powers do states have to infringe that right? Well, under the Supreme Court's current jurisprudence, they say they can't because it's covered by the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. Now, I think that kind of incorporating amendments into, sort of shoehorning it into the 14th Amendment, I think is analytically suspicious. I think what a lot of people said when the Second Amendment was being tested in the McDonald case, which was the Illinois case, was that really this is the time to revive the Privileges or Immunities Clause of the 14th Amendment. And there's a lot of evidence that when the framers of the 14th Amendment wrote the Privileges or Immunities Clause, they were attempting to give federal protection at the state level to certain fundamental rights, and they didn't enumerate them, but there's a lot of evidence that the right to bear arms was one of those rights. And so the Supreme Court, I think, really messed up by failing to recognize that really this is a case that should have been decided under Privileges or Immunities.
Is that what Raoul Berger wrote about that? The Privileges and Immunity Clause? I can't remember. I read him a while ago.
I know. Well, I know for sure that Randy Barnett did.
Okay.
In the lead up to the McDonald case. I don't know about Berger.
I got to follow up to that. So the D.C. handgun ban was recently struck down. Okay. So does that mean you could challenge the constitutionality of like the New York City SAFE Act as a violation of the Second Amendment?
You could, but the challenges rest on different grounds slightly because D.C. is under federal jurisdiction, so you don't need the 14th Amendment for that. That you just challenge it directly under the Second Amendment. For the state laws, you challenge it under the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. But after McDonald, there have been dozens, if not hundreds, of challenges to state and local laws. Very few have succeeded. Because the judiciary is biased against the Second Amendment rights, and so that there hasn't been as much success at the state and local level as one might hope.
So, like when Kansas and Texas passed constitutional carry, when they say constitutional carry, they mean state constitutional carry, not federal constitutional carry.
Yeah, no, that's right. But I think even in New York, I think it was in New York where they initially had a proposed law which required, I think, required guns to have a magazine size that simply wasn't manufactured. I mean, it was just impossible. And I think the legislature just realized that was going to get struck down. I mean, you cannot, even under a liberal reading of the Supreme Court's precedents, you cannot make it impossible to own a weapon of self-defense.
Actually, what's really funny is this is going off what you just said about making it impossible. New York passed a series of laws like you can't have a gun with a pistol grip, you can't have a gun with a retractable stock, blah, 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 essentially attempting to ban assault like AR-15s, and this gun company came out and made an AR-15 that is specifically New York compliant and is like slightly modified, so you can actually own one in New York and you're not in violation of the law.
All right,
Thank
Maddie.
you very much, that was great.
My turn?
Yes, go ahead, Maddie.
Thanks for on the show, Adam. Admittedly, I don't know anything about law or anything Will has been talking about for the past 42 minutes, so I'll just keep this pretty simple. So like a semester or two ago, I was simultaneously taking a political science class and a law class. And in political science, I learned that federal law trumps state law. And then on the first day of my law class, I learned that it's a myth that federal law trumps state law. And neither professor could explain to me why the other one was wrong, so could you explain that to me?
Sure.
All right, awesome.
Yeah. Well, the Constitution has the Constitution speaks about this only in the Supremacy Clause, and the Supremacy Clause says that the Constitution and the laws made pursuant thereto are the supreme law of the land. Okay. So that's true. It's not true, though, that Congress is supreme. So it doesn't mean that anything that Congress says is supreme. It's the Constitution and laws that are made pursuant to the Constitution. So constitutional laws that are within Congress's enumerated powers are supreme. But that is different from what is the practical, or I should say the prevailing doctrine of preemption, which is a much broader doctrine. And so, in one of your professors might have been talking about preemption, because there is this doctrine in the courts that when the federal government moves into some field of policy with an intent, as they say, to occupy the field, then states can't legislate it within that area at all. Now, I think that that's a made-up doctrine, and I think it's overbroad. But so the philosophical answer, I think, is what I said about the Supremacy Clause. But the practical answer is the preemption doctrine has given the federal government a monopoly over huge areas of policy.
All right.
Okay, Kevin.
That problem.
I know Kevin has more questions. I see him looking down there for the last hour.
Yeah, I do. I have one more question I was going to ask about. Donald Trump made some waves recently when he talked about whether or not birthright citizenship is actually constitutional. And he claims that a reading of the Constitution will prove, and he says that he's got his lawyers that say that it proves that it's not constitutional, was not in the intention of the founders, that people who are born in the United States that are, say, for example, from parents of illegal immigrants, that they are not actually, they're not citizens by law. And it's interesting because there were two people who wrote for the National Review who had different opinions on this. And I know, this is why I'm looking down, because I was just reading one of them. John Woo said that he believes that Trump is wrong. And he says that that precedent, that the intention of the founders, as well as the amendment itself, all agree that birthright citizenship is the law of the land, and if you make it to America and you have a child, that child is an American citizen. there's another side to the story, and I wanted to see if you could elaborate on it, because if I'm not mistaken, you actually disagree with that, you as well as the other writer for the National Review, who was Edward Erler, and we wanted to get your take on that.
Yeah, that's right. The concept of birthright citizenship does come from the 14th Amendment, that says that all persons born within the United States are entitled to citizenship. But there's an important bit of language in there. It doesn't just say all persons born within the United States. It's all persons born within the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. And if all Congress and the states wanted to do was make birthright citizenship, there would have been no reason to add the words "and subject to the jurisdiction thereof." There was some intent there. They wanted to limit the scope of birthright citizenship. And so we have to delve into the original meaning of that clause to figure out, why did they not just say all persons born in the United States? Why did they say all persons born in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof? So there is contemporary evidence about the kinds of persons they were meant to exclude. I think partly this had to do with American Indians. So American Indians were, they belonged to still sovereign nations, as they are still sometimes considered. And so, we had treaties with Indian nations, and so they didn't want to suggest that, for better or worse, the framers of the 14th Amendment did not want to confer automatic citizenship on all Native Americans. That was actually accomplished by a separate piece of legislation later on. And so there was also children of ambassadors, children of military belligerents. It was people whose parents did not owe their primary allegiance to the United States. Now, illegal aliens, that wasn't an issue at the time of the 14th Amendment. We didn't have a federal immigration law at that time, and so there was, which is itself an interesting point for consideration. But there was no real concept of illegal aliens then, and so the issue didn't arise. So, but we have to look back at and try to analogize. Are the children of illegal aliens like the children of ambassadors or enemy belligerents? Are they somebody whose family does not owe its primary allegiance to the United States? And I think there's an argument that can be made that that's the case. You have to make it by analogy. Certainly, there's no binding precedent on the issue, and even John Yoo will concede this. The Supreme Court has never spoken directly to the concept of birthright citizenship for illegal aliens. The precedent that is cited concerns the child of a legal immigrant, legal immigrants from China. So I think that the best reading of the 14th Amendment is that you would not give birthright citizenship to the children of illegal aliens, people who were only there by virtue of the fact that their parents violated the law.
Right. Well, I mean, the case that you mentioned, U.S. versus Wu Kim Ark, was 1898, I believe. It was Chinese citizens, or were they citizens at the time? They left the United States with their child, and then when they came back, there was a new law saying essentially they couldn't come back, and they sued, saying that their son or daughter was born in the United States, and therefore under the law should be considered a citizen. Are you saying that does not qualify for an illegal person, an illegal immigrant?
They were legal residents of the United States when their child was born. They had complied with all laws, and whatever measure of loyalty the United States required of the Ark family at that time, they gave. And so I would argue that at the time that child was born, that family was fully subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. Much less clear, I think, for a family that sneaks across the border and has not made the decision to integrate itself into the legal the legal structure of American society. And so, look, I mean, this is totally separate from immigration policy. Of course, you can be for, open borders, high immigration quotas. We're just talking about what's the most honest reading of the 14th Amendment. And I find it hard to believe that the framers would have considered a family that has illegally snuck across the border as being a family that has subjected itself to the jurisdiction of the United States.
Do you think that that if a Trump or one of his lawyers brought the case to court and it went up to the Supremes, how do you think they would rule?
Oh, it's really hard to it's hard to know for sure. I mean, I'm not optimistic about cases like that, right? Because it's highly disruptive. It's a highly charged political topic. I think that the Supreme Court would just play it safe and argue, stare decisis, which is the usual easy excuse when you don't want to upset established precedent.
Gotcha. Thank you.
All right, one more question, well, there's so many questions, but one more quick question. Kim Davis, it was Kim, right, guys? Is that what, Kim or Kate? I don't remember. Do you see that as a form of interposition, her exercising her right? I mean, yes, she's a county clerk. Yes, she has constituents she was voted in. But not a single one of her constituents, nor not a single one of her state representatives voted to have the state recognize same-sex marriages. So do you see what she did? Do you see what she did as an act of interposition to protect states' rights of self-government?
I don't in Kim Davis's case. I think it's an exercise. I think it's an example of the free exercise of religion and the need for government to find ways to accommodate the free exercise of religion. Mm-hmm. As a lot of commentators have said, look, I mean, the courts have forced, they've forced states to provide Qurans to people in prison, to allow people to practice. I mean, they allow under the free exercise clause, they allow prisoners to practice witchcraft, Wiccan religion. And so, for heaven's sakes, a good-willed county clerk ought to be accommodated in her beliefs. But the reason why it's not interposition under the way the decision came down is this isn't a matter of a state implementing a federal program which you can interpose. It's a question of, as the court has phrased it, an individual right, the right to gay marriage, which applies directly to the states through the 14th Amendment. So it's not a case of a state interposing its authority to refuse to implement a federal program. This has been decreed as a right that applies directly to the states.
Now, just to challenge you there, Madison wrote about individuals having a right to interpose, and you're right. The thing was one judge declared it a right, unconstitutionally, usurping the powers of the other branches and usurping the powers of the states. Yeah. I mean, let's say she's irreligious and she said, look, I want to protect my state's sovereign right to decide this on their own, and I refuse to sign these. Mm-hmm. What right does she have as a sovereign party to the Constitution, herself as an individual, and as a resident of, I don't know what state she was, what was it, whatever state it is.
I think she's Kentucky, isn't she?
Yeah, Kentucky. As a sovereign voter of Kentucky and as a sovereign party to the Constitution, what right does she have to check? Why does Kennedy have power over her? This one guy, it's literally 5'4", this guy through a fundamental rights doctrine, which is carte blanche to turn anything into a right. You can turn, I have a right to drive a car, I have a right to punch you in the face. They could say literally anything, and it's so ambiguous, whatever it is. What is her, as a sovereign citizen, I mean, that ticks me off. I want the opportunity in California to go ahead and vote and say, yes, I want to allow same-sex marriage here. They took that away from me. Where's my power? That's what ticks me off.
Yeah, yeah. Look, I think as a matter of interposition, I think that a state or even a county government has the right to say that we don't agree with Obergefell, and they can create their own solution. Now, hopefully, it's a solution that is, I don't think anyone should be vindictive about it. I mean, I personally think, look, you should accommodate people in those ways too. You have civil unions. You have, there are ways to accommodate that. But yes, I think that if, for example, if the state of California wanted to go back to the days of Prop 8, which I think was, I think the state of California had a very workable solution, right? They had marriage defined in the traditional way.
Yes.
With the overwhelming support of African American voters and Hispanic voters across the state, and they had a very generous civil union policy.
It was domestic partnership, which gave all the same privileges and restrictions as a marriage. It was the same thing. Yes.
That's right. And I think California, under the doctrine of interposition, should be able to say, we respectfully disagree with the Supreme Court. We're going to go our own way. Mm-hmm. But I think that's different in the case of Kim Davis, because she's not authorized under Kentucky law to make policy. Mm-hmm. And so I think that her choice has to be, I think it has to be construed as a matter of individual religious liberty.
Okay.
That the government should accommodate.
I could see that's a good argument. I disagree. I do, only because she's a sovereign party to the Constitution. And as you say, yes, under state law, perhaps not, but as a party to the Constitution, I think the individual does have some responsibility. Moreover, she got it all over the news. I think that's a way of interposition to make other states look. This is a problem here. I guess you could disagree about it. Yeah. I see your argument. It's a very, very good one. It's a strong argument, and I should consider better that it was declared a fundamental right and not just merely a statute. All right, so we have about 5 minutes left. We usually do our winners and losers of the week. Adam, I'll get to you last. I know you didn't come prepared. I know for sure Matt didn't come prepared.
Oh, hell no.
You just got done eating oranges at soccer practice. Your mom just dropped you up out of the pan here. All right, I will come back to you later. I'm going to go to Grant first, because Grant's always pretty good.
Losers.
Go ahead, Grant.
All right, so my winner this week is Vladimir Putin. I don't agree with
That's a good one. That's a good one.
I don't agree with Putin's foreign policy in the Middle East, but he is running all over Barack Obama right now. He's got Obama with his tail between his legs. I mean, he bombed Syria. He didn't really he bombed anti-Assad people, not ISIS. So he's really just walked in the Middle East and just.
I'm going to defend Obama. I'm going to defend Obama here. That's the way Obama wants it. I don't think Obama sees it that way. I think this is what he wanted.
Regardless, everyone else sees it as walking in the
I agree.
Like, I can do whatever I want. I don't care what you say. Mm-hmm. So that's hilarious. But my loser of the week, this is breaking news. For the last 2 weeks, pretty much, liberals have been just loving the Pope. They've just been all over it. It turns out the Pope visited with Kim Davis while he was in America and told her to remain strong and stay steadfast in her faith. So I'm sure they're losing their mind.
Oh, very good, Grant. Mine are terrible now. I got to revise mine.
So those are my winners and losers.
Go ahead, Kevin.
Well, to piggyback on what Nico Bellic said there, President Assad is the real winner. President Assad now has the full weight of the Russian, at least their Air Force, behind him, and there's no way he's going to get driven from power by the anti-Assad militia at this point. And you've got the U.S. and some other coalitions ostensibly going against ISIS. So really, it's looking good for Assad right now. The loser, which is actually of 2 weeks ago because we didn't have this last week, is Volkswagen. And also, I believe, environmentalists in a way, because the reason diesel is so popular, especially in Europe, where it's basically 50% of all vehicles, is because it's so fuel efficient. And if they have to conform to regulations on every single emission that's put out, they're not going to be fuel efficient anymore, and that's going to be the case in America and so forth. That's why Volkswagen cheated the regulators, was to make their car more fuel efficient, and now they're not going to be fuel efficient anymore. So
that's pretty good too. I fell asleep halfway through it, but that was pretty good. Matt, do you have anything?
Yeah, my winner of the week is Adam Elliott. I'm sure you guys have seen him on Unbiased America. The thing I like about Adam is he always grasps our intentions. He always knows what's going on in our heads, so we make a point, and he always addresses exactly what we're saying. So he is my winner of the week. He's just so insightful. And you know what? I'm just a nice guy. No losers this week.
Oh, pretty good. Okay, I have one more question, though, actually, Adam. In the GOP field right now, who do you feel is the strongest pro-constitutional candidate? It doesn't have to be one. To me, there's a couple. But who do you feel is most, as an originalist, the best originalist running today that would do a good job in executing the laws?
Yeah, I think from that standpoint, Rand Paul probably has the sort of deepest feeling for the Constitution and the original meaning of the Constitution. You know, whether or not he's the best candidate, I leave to others. I think it's still kind of silly season in the Republican primaries right now. But Rand Paul is always impressive when he talks about the Constitution.
How do you feel about Ted Cruz?
Cruz as well. I mean, he's right up there as well. And before he was a senator, was a very serious legal kind of policy wonk at the Texas Institute for Public Policy, which is a great organization. And so, yeah, I mean, he's also.
Yeah, those are my two favorites for sure. Yeah. My winners and losers this week. My winners are the New York Mets because they're going to win the World Series. So if that hasn't become obvious to everybody here in this panel and in the rest of the world, I don't know what to tell you.
They must be your loser of the week.
Clearly,
hey, when was the last time the Mets won the World Series?
Don't worry about that, Grant. It was 1986. So what? What does that have to do with anything?
I wasn't born yet, and Kevin was graduating high school.
Look at how Boston did with the what did they win in 2003? It was many years before. Oh yeah. Yeah, that was, they had a long gap there. And the Rangers, it was 54-94. Don't worry about it. My loser of the week, that's a tough one. There's just so many losers. I think it was, what's the gal's name from Planned Parenthood?
Cecil Richards.
Cecil Richards, who had to reluctantly admit that Planned Parenthood doesn't have any mammograms. They do not offer mammograms, no matter how many times you've heard people say, oh, women's health this, women's this. There's not a single mammogram machine in any of the Planned Parenthood things. And I would extrapolate on that. Most of the Democrat Party, who, when Jason Chaffetz questioned her salary, they wanted to know how much money she made. They called him a misogynist, a woman hater. I was shocked. The demagoguery that was happening in the House committee yesterday was appalling. I just couldn't believe what I was watching. It was a real kabuki court. It really bothers me. So I'm going to go to Adam. Your winners and losers. If you
well, yeah. So as you said, I didn't come prepared, but I guess if I was forced, I would probably say that the loser is probably John Boehner, who just abdicated his seat. Although he seemed to be pretty happy about doing it, but still, had to declare defeat in the face of protests among the backbenchers. And winner, I'm not sure. I mean, maybe Joe Biden. Just even if he decides not to run, everyone likes him more and more every day as Hillary looks worse and worse.
No, that's true. I mean, Joe Biden, look, if this guy gets into the race, he literally knows nothing about anything, but man, is he a good politician. Yeah. He is shrewd. And I don't know if you guys remember back to the debates what he had with Paul Ryan in 2012, the vice presidential debates. He mopped that guy up.
I think Fresh White Strips must have sponsored that debate. Remember how he was smiling?
Oh, yeah.
An hour, 2 hours of...
That thing was gleaming. But anyway, it's getting late. I want to thank Adam Freedman, and stay on for a minute, Adam, even after we go off air. And for Adam Freedman, please buy his books. A Less Perfect Union is on Amazon right now. It's a perfect follow-up to the Naked Constitution, so I'll buy them both. I would read this one first and then this one second, and you'll know literally 99.9% more about the Constitution than Congress, the Senate, the President, and most definitely the Supreme Court. I mean, it is just baffling how these people come up with half of these things they say. Also, Grant, you had some good stuff come out this week on the Modern Libertarian. I forgot what it was on. It was on welfare.
It was about this new research paper from the ECB, basically saying that social welfare spending decreases net household wealth and increases wealth inequality, and it adversely impacts lower income households more so than higher income households.
Perfect.
So by advocating for Social Security and public welfare spending, you're inadvertently advocating for policies that correlate to higher levels of inequality.
Actually, if Grant, if I ask you a brief question, I've noticed that in like Sweden and Denmark they have very low income inequality but very high wealth inequality. So is the paper arguing that, in the statistics it'll reduce income inequality because, you're taking from one to another, but in the long run, it destroys incentives to create wealth, so there's no accumulation
It's
of wealth.
specifically about wealth inequality, and
Okay, no,
yeah, because it basically when you subsidize low risk assets in the form of like retirement accounts and stuff like that, people in higher income with higher incomes and access to financial markets, they invest in higher risk portfolios because you're subsidizing their low risk assets, and then poor people just basically they just spend more money because you're subsidizing their retirement instead of it encourages them to not accumulate wealth. Basically, it's an incentive. It's what it is.
Right.
And Kevin Ryan from Unbiased America, who you just reviewed all the tax plans for the candidates and posted it. It's very good. Whatever tax plans they had come out already. And Matt Palumbo from Being Classically Liberal.
Go
ahead.
I launched a YouTube channel. Not launched, but my friend Jay and I, it's youtube.com/wearecapitalists. It's actually Grant's page, basically. But Jay and I do, all of us do participate, but we do like a weekly video on some political topics, so I guess go subscribe if you listen.
Okay. And they're amazing, by the way. Every one of them goes viral.
Yeah.
I think the one a couple times ago has 2 million hits or something.
Very good.
The gun control one's like 350K views and like 1 million hits or something crazy.
Adam, do you have anything you want to, any columns or anything you want to plug before we go, or a website?
Well, I contribute regularly to Ricochet.com, which, if you haven't been there, is I think a great place for conservative conversations. Got all spectrums posted, and then also I contribute to City Journal over at the Manhattan Institute, which is another great journal of conservative ideas.
All right. Would you just, and one last question, sorry, I have so many more, but one last one. Do you consider yourself more a conservative or a libertarian, or just a constitutionalist?
Well, yeah, I consider myself a conservative constitutionalist. I think a lot of ideas that I have probably resonate with libertarians, but I don't describe myself as a libertarian.
Okay. I still don't know what I am, so I'm still trying to figure that out. But it's a little bit of both, I suppose. All right.
You're transitioning right now.
I am transitioning. I identify as a liberal of the classical variety, but no. All right. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you next week. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Enforcing the Fugitive Slave Acts and so forth, which the North found morally repugnant. Can you explain a little bit of that for the viewers? I think libertarians get a little bit confused on this sometimes. A lot of them just parrot that, states' rights for this in defense of the South, and they just couldn't be more incorrect.
That's right, Will. And almost half of my book is really a kind of revisionist history, and it was a very deliberate choice to call this book the case for states' rights rather than the case for federalism, because federalism as a word has really been diluted into just some kind of vague recognition that states kind of exist and they can participate in implementing federal laws. Well, that doesn't really get you anywhere. States' rights, the original doctrine of the United States being a union of states, a compact among states, really needs to be revived. And so I went back through the history and talked about this way that really in the antebellum era, the slave powers held all the cards at the federal level. There was no federal threat to slavery.
Mm-hmm. And in fact, Lincoln acknowledged that. Lincoln said there's nothing that I can do about slavery. So I'm sorry, continue.
Yeah, no, that's right. That's right. Lincoln never proposed.
It is really the case for states' rights. A lot of people will tell you that states don't have rights. Only people do. Is states' rights the correct terminology to use when defending federalism?
Yeah, I think so. And I always find it odd that people say that states don't have rights. States are legal entities that have powers and rights. They have duties, powers, rights. And in the international context, people left and right have no problem talking about states' rights. They always say that that Ukraine has the right to self-determination, or Tibet has the right to be free. But when you bring that home to America and say, well, doesn't Alabama have the right to self-determination when it comes to things like health care or environmental law? Suddenly, the idea of states' rights doesn't sit so well with a lot of progressives. But absolutely, I think states have rights, and the founders did too.
Okay. Moving along, I like you talk a lot in the book about how states' rights is the term has really been used to deride federalism. That it's this the racist term. That states' rights was used as a defense for the southern states to secede. That it's our right to enslave other people. Where in fact you really lucidly clear it up. I think this might be the most important part about the book, is where you talk about that the southern states were trying to use the federal apparatus to coerce the northern states into... All right, hello everybody. Welcome to Unbiased America Live. We're back here. We have a special guest today. We'll get to that in a second. But first, I will introduce our panel, our semi-regular panel. We have Kevin Ryan at the bottom of your screen there with the collared shirt on that looks like it's never been washed.
I would like to say I have been regular for at least a couple weeks.
He's the purveyor of Unbiased America, which is the father of this program. Also, we have, as usual, Grant Phillips, who's the purveyor of The Modern Libertarian and a contributor to We Are Capitalists, who have been coming out with some of those great videos on capitalism. And I think that we should actually extrapolate that into some constitutional provisos as well. And with us tonight, we have a special guest. It is author Adam Freedman of A Naked Constitution and A Less Perfect Union, The Case for States' Rights. Very good books. When people ask me, because I write about the Constitution for Unbiased America, people always ask me, they want an introductory book into understanding the Constitution, and Grant has asked me this too, and I always recommend The Naked Constitution because it's easy. When I say easy to read, I mean it has a good flow to it. There's a lot of information in there. You could look it all up. It has a great notes section in the back.
We're all about states' rights, and so the challenge is to make the argument. And this is what I tried to do in the book: make the argument in a way that would appeal to both left and right to understand that really the future is in your states and communities. That's where government should take place. So
essentially, that federalism it fosters diversity and tolerance throughout throughout the geographic distance of the United States. I mean, there's a lot of people in Texas are different than those in New York. People in New York are different than those in California. So they could tailor their government to their own predilections.
That's right, and it's never been clearer, I think, than now in this sort of age of Obama. And look at what the administration is doing to people like the Little Sisters of the Poor that are now forced to provide contraception when it's completely against their beliefs. And that if one state did that, that would be unfortunate. But now, when the federal government does it, it's a tragedy. They're taking away the rights nationwide of religious believers. The federal government has forced a definition of marriage down the throats of the entire country. And so if liberals like to talk about diversity, if they really want diversity, they should let states be states.
Okay. My next question is about the premise of your book. It's states' rights. I mean, it's a defense. There's not so much legalese in it, and there's great stories that relate it to real-life constitutional provisions and jurisprudence that you can relate to your own life. I first want to ask, not necessarily, well, I'll start with A Less Perfect Union. What was the reason for writing A Less Perfect Union? Do you see federalism itself, or federalism in the eyes of the framers, as a way to mitigate a lot of the problems we're seeing at the federal level and their usurpation of states' rights?
Yes. Hi, Will, and it's great to be on. Thanks for having me on the show. And that's exactly right. I think when I look out at the political landscape, and after I finished Naked Constitution, I was not optimistic about the idea at the federal level of really restoring constitutional government as it was originally understood at the federal level, but I think that we have a chance to get closer to that with states' rights, because there's something in states' rights for everyone. You know, there are blue states that want to be a little bit more liberal than Washington sometimes. There are a lot of red states that would like to be, you know, more conservative than Washington. And, you know, when George W. Bush was president, liberals